coming to you on the Talkstar Radio Network, Mutual Broadcast Network, and of course, Channel 54 on Simul TV. Exonation, my guest this hour is Beverly Trout, and we're going to be talking to Beverly, who is a lifelong abductee experiencer and a 28-year member of MUFON. Joining me now is Beverly Trout, and Beverly, welcome to the X Zone.
Good evening. Good to be here.
Tell us a little bit more about yourself, Beverly.
Well, as you indicated, I was 28 years investigator for MUFON, and then in July of 2020, I decided to become an independent researcher. I appreciated the years with MUFON.
Mm-hmm.
I had the thought, the idea that it would be well if the investigation teams would know more about the paranormal. And so this was a concern for me, since when I interact with witnesses, the ones who have had encounters, they usually have a desire to maintain contact with me and have further conversation about high strangeness and, in fact, some of their paranormal some of the stuff in their lives that have been happening at the paranormal level. And so this really led me to want to take out on my own and interact. And I'd always had a lot of private cases come to me directly anyway, instead of going through MUFON. Many witnesses, in fact, I would think at least 99 out of 100 do not want their identities known when they report a sighting or an encounter and so on. And so, this leads to not wanting to go through an organization for some. And so those private cases would come to me directly, and so ongoing conversation would ensue.
What was it that made you want to become a member of MUFON and to carry on the investigations that you do?
Well, for many years, I sort of shoved aside whatever faint awareness of UFOs that might have kind of crept into my dreams or whatever. And finally, actually, first in 1967, we had a sighting at the farm. I was married to a farmer for many years, Rob, and we had a dairy operation.
Mm-hmm.
And there came a Saturday night before Easter, as a matter of fact, of that year of 1967. And it was what I would call late dusk. I had come into the barnyard from the barn. We actually had a milking parlor. My husband then came into the barnyard, and we observed a light that began to move very slowly at an angle across a creek that ran by our cattle lots. And it moved very slowly, and we're standing in the barnyard, and I remember my husband muttering, "We don't want to get too excited about this." But of course, we're standing there knowing that we can't explain what we're seeing, and this light moved very slowly, maybe 10, 15 miles an hour, and it was not very far above the treetops. I would estimate no more than 100 feet altitude, and probably 200 to 300 feet away from us land distance. When it got right across the road from us, then it did a right angle turn, and absolutely took off at great speed. So this was kind of interesting, and the next day, the milk hauler came to pump the milk from our 1,000-gallon tank. And we were in the milk house at the time that he came, and my husband proceeded to tell him what we had seen the night before. And he proceeded to tell us that about 3.5 miles away from us at another farm, something had landed down on the railroad tracks back of those buildings. Now, I was very naive in those days. I'm talking 1967. And so a day or two later, I went to that farmhouse, and the wife was home. And so I'm asking what was seen, and she said, "Oh, we didn't see anything." And of course, I learned very quickly at that time in 1967 that, there were many who did not want to talk about such things. So that was kind of a big trigger. But, even then, out on the farm and with a family and so on, you can shove things aside. Actually shove an element of reality aside. So, it wasn't until 1991 in the fall that I became a member of MUFON, and it was as if a switch had turned on in my mind somewhere. Don't ask me how that was affected, how that was brought about, but it did. And then I read a book or two, and I had already been interested in the paranormal from the 1960s. So a little of the UFO stuff had crept into my awareness, But it was like a switch turned on. And so in 1992, as I sat at my dining table, I thought to myself, investigations are where it's at. And that's, the trigger, really.
All right, so you had the sighting in 1967 at your farm, a dairy farm, which means there's a lot of cows there.
Right.
And then the farm down the way from you also had seen this craft, but it landed on the railroad tracks. Am I correct?
Well, from the way it was related. Now, this is a bit of speculation on my part. I think what we saw might have been in the nature of, because it didn't look like it was large. It was a light. And if I had to guess, and this would be merely speculation, I would guess that it probably was an unmanned object of some sort, perhaps no larger than maybe 5 or 6 feet from the size as we were just observing it. Now, what landed by the railroad tracks, I don't even know, because, of course, my efforts to find out did not bear fruit.
Gotcha. So the fact that you were a dairy farmer with cattle, was there any evidence of cattle mutilation on your ranch?
None whatsoever, no. And I did in later years talk with a sheriff in a nearby county, asking him, and he said, yeah, we've had them, but of course, you see that those were not reported to me when I was with MUFON. However, in 1998, I was asked to go up to South Dakota and interact with some farmers up there who had mutilations, and that was a very interesting trip, I must say.
Now, in the information that you supplied my producer, you say that you're a lifelong abductee and experiencer. Tell me about your abduction experience.
Okay, I obviously was either, well, probably both. I either blocked out my early, my childhood, my adult years. I blocked it out mostly, except for some dreams that, would sort of occur from time to time. And so in 1993, I did undergo several hypnosis sessions with a psychiatrist in Iowa who understood the so-called abduction syndrome. And so I did, regain. And by the way, that was very light hypnosis. At least that was my impression. I once said to him, it didn't seem to me that I was a very good subject. And he looked at me like I was crazy because he thought I was. I always knew what I was saying to him. And I always knew if he misstated back to me what I had said, and I would correct him. However, I was coming up with some information that was just really very startling to me, frankly. However, in 1993, I began to have some conscious encounters. And so those became rather interesting. And obviously, conscious encounters get your attention.
So tell us about the encounters that you can remember, the conscious encounters.
Okay.
or the conscious abductions, I should say.
Yeah. Well, the first one, I did not have any indication of being taken aboard.
Hmm.
However, I was traveling on Interstate 80 from the San Francisco Bay Area, where my daughter and her family lived, and coming back to Iowa. This was over Labor Day weekend of 1993. I stopped. Actually, I got a late start, so I was not overly tired or anything like that. And so I stopped at Winnemucca, Nevada. Got a Motel 6 room for the night, and as is usual, was reading and at bedtime, but for some reason stayed awake until about 2 or 2:30. Well, then I must have drifted off because suddenly there was this tremendous energy that was directed at me. No ifs, ands, or buts, wake up. And I was allowed to observe two individuals come through the wall at the foot of the bed. Very much conscious, no other possibility. And they very calmly walked in. It was a female and a male. The female sat down in the chair that was closest to my head. However, they did interact briefly with my physical self a bit. And then the male on the other side of the small table that you usually see in some of these motel arrangements. And I was aware, and I don't know how to tell you I was aware, but I was aware that there was something hovering above the building that was monitoring everything that was going on inside. And basically, they began to communicate with me, and the female doing most of the communication.
All right, we're going to have to take a break here. Please stand by. Exonation, our guest this hour is Beverly Trout. She is a lifelong abductee and experiencer, and she was with the Mutual UFO Network for 28 years as an investigator. And we'll be back on the other side of this break as we continue our conversation with Beverly Trout. Don't go away. Welcome back. Beverly Trout is our special guest, and Beverly is in Perry, Iowa, joining us tonight. And before we went to the break, you were telling us about the two extraterrestrials that walked through a wall in your motel room while you were somewhere, and you believe that there was a UFO hovering over atop this motel while this experience that you were having was being was happening. Now, were you taken aboard a craft?
Not on that occasion.
Why do you think you were chosen? Why do you think they decided to make contact with Beverly Trout?
Well, they explained that, I guess. And that's the next thing that I need to say is that the communication was that if I could tolerate it, I could have further conscious encounter. And of course, I have to say that at that point there was quite a welling of perhaps some kind of deep-seated appreciation for this, for whatever that indicates, because I was so grateful to think, yeah, okay, conscious encounters. And as a matter of fact, then 12 weeks later at my residence in Iowa, they were back and waking me up in the same exact way. And, I was taken on another, and this time, yes, I was, it was for more of I was taken out of the residence where I live, I'll put it that way.
Now, how were you taken out?
Sometimes there can be, the technology is, of course, so advanced. And by the way, some groups have more technology than others. It has been my observation. And so the technology, they can either open a door and take you through that way, or they can, dispense with opening the door, etc. And so, you have this kind of thing. However, obviously you're interested in some of my experiences, and I've got a few more that I can tell you about. But, I've got so many interesting cases in Iowa with witnesses that just it's these are witnesses not looking for attention
Right.
whatsoever. And there's some really startling cases that I've been involved in. So I don't mean to take all the time talking about myself.
Well, you see, the reason I brought you on the show is I wanted to hear about your experiences, your abduction, your lifelong experiences.
Right.
Not to take away from the importance of the cases that you've worked on, but talking to you is firsthand. You're the person who had the experience.
Right.
The other people that you've done the investigations for, that would be secondhand information for me. Whereas I'm talking to you, you're the person who has had the abduction experiences and experienced UFOs. So this is why right now I'm more interested in you than I am in the cases that you've worked on. And I'm sure our audience is as well, because it's not hard for people to pick up books and read about experiences that other people have had. But to have the ability to talk to somebody like yourself who has actually had contact, they're rare. So that's why I'm very interested in your case as an experiencer and an abductee. I'm certain that your experiences certainly gave you an inside knowledge of what the people that you were investigating, and you could easily tell whether they've had a real encounter or a real experience, or they were just making it up.
Right.
So what did you learn from all the abductions that you had? What did you learn? What did you see? And did you bring back any evidence from any of your experiences?
I don't know of anyone who really has been allowed to bring back evidence.
Okay.
And when they have tried. I had one witness, for instance, who was taken to the moon at least twice in 2021, basically to show him bases up there. And the closest, he said, the transporter that was to bring them back, he recognized somebody on the transporter. Well, that's as close as he got, but anyway, he was conscious during that encounter and so on. And
but with this gentleman who went to the moon a couple of times, how do we know that he really went there, that it wasn't a dream?
Yeah, right. I understand what you're saying. And actually, with with most witnesses, not all, because maybe some of them have some, cell phone photos or whatever, some video to show. But with any, what we're listening to as investigators is their perception of what they have seen or been subject to. And then I should throw in the fact that there can be screen memories which can be set into motion by UFO crews. Sometimes, that needs definition, screen memory.
Right.
Okay, and if you're interested in that definition, I'd be interested in giving it. For instance, I had a witness who, now this particular incident happened in 1997, this first one, to illustrate. This gentleman and his then teenage son decided to go hunting on a Sunday afternoon, and there had been fresh snow on the ground. They didn't intend to kill anything, but they thought it'd be nice to be out and around. And so they come up over a rise, and they're looking down toward a creek bed, and along the bank of that creek bed, they observe, their perception says that they're looking at a wolf. Now, this was in southern Iowa, We may have some wolves in Iowa, but they're not all that numerous. They're looking at this wolf who looked to be almost frantically dashing back and forth along the creek bank. And then the wolf simply departed the area. And the father is turning to the son and saying, "What'd you see?" And he's saying, "I saw a wolf." Both of them had that perception. Thankfully, they were inquiring enough to go down the area, and in that fresh snow, you know what I'm going to say next. They checked for tracks, and there were no tracks.
Mm-hmm.
There was a screen memory, something totally different taking place. We don't know what, but certainly the dots could not all be connected. Now, I've got another example which actually happened at a town, it was north of the town of Adel, Iowa, in 2004. A couple had been out of state on a short weekend vacation, and they were back on their way back home, southbound, at about 2:30 in the morning. And there were three things that occurred. Now, I could rule out the first thing if the other two had not occurred. First of all, they reported that a deer came on the highway. Well, we've got a lot of deer in Iowa, so that's not unusual. They drove on. They didn't hit the deer, thankfully, and so they drove on 2 miles.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an ambulance sitting in the center of the highway. The headlights were on. The driver's door was open. The area lights were on, as if, there's an emergency to work, so we have to know what's in the area. The rear doors were open. The flashers were not on. And there was no emergency to be worked. There was no one in the area. There was no farmhouse nearby. Nothing. So they drive on down the road from this empty ambulance, and a couple of miles on, right beside the highway, is what appears to be a man. He was not engaged in any activity which would justify his stance or his presence. And at this point, the driver is saying, "Well, should I stop?" And his companion is saying, No, drive on. Because by this time they were pretty well spooked. So, how to explain the ambulance. And by the way, the man standing by the highway, no car around, no farmhouse around, nothing.
Let me ask you, why didn't the people in this story contact the police if you come across an empty ambulance in the middle of the road? That would be my first thing.
Well, it might be, except by this time they already knew that they had been exposed to some pretty high strangeness. And when you contact
come on.
Oftentimes come on.
Listen, I'm an ex-member of law enforcement. So when I hear a story like this, it makes no sense to me. It really doesn't. You come across an ambulance in the middle of the road, there's nobody in it, you can't see anybody, you just ignore the fact that this is strange, and you don't call the police. That makes no sense to me.
Well, it didn't make much sense to them either, but they were really spooked by this. They were really shook. This was high strangeness, and they recognized it as such. I'm glad that there are some law enforcement who might be eager to look into these things, but I don't know that would be very common.
It is where I come from.
Good. Glad to hear it.
Mm-hmm. So this strange, what do you call it? Strange awareness or?
High strangeness.
High strangeness. How does this relate to the UFO phenomena?
Well, I would say that it is engineered, orchestrated. by a technology, that appears to be
Hmm.
considerably advanced from our own. And so this would seem to fit very well into the UFO scenarios.
You were with MUFON for 28 years. Why did you leave?
Well, I had become interested in the 1960s in the paranormal, and I saw it as I saw the paranormal as a really important component. Could be a very to know about when you're investigating
Hmm.
with people, because after all, many witnesses, I would say most that I've interacted with, have the paranormal in their lives. If they've got the UFO, if they're having sightings, and if there's anything repeated here,
Hmm.
uh, more than once and so on, they're involved in both. And so it seemed to me that investigators needed to be involved in more deeply understanding the paranormal themselves. And I didn't necessarily see in 2020 that, MUFON was, necessarily very willing to go in that direction. And so, I just thought it was better, since I already had private cases anyway,
Hmm.
and on an ongoing basis.
All right, stand by. I've got to take my break at the bottom of the hour. X Zone Nation, our guest this hour is Beverly Trout. And Beverly and I will be back on the other side of this short break. Don't go away. Beverly Trout is with us. And Beverly, what do you think the connection between the paranormal and UFOs are?
Well, it's obvious to me in the investigation process that you can have the paranormal. Hey, these ETs, they have consciousness technology. In other words, paranormal, as well as physical
Hmm.
technology. That seems to be very obvious. Um, and of course, there can be the strictly paranormal incidents that can be very interesting as well. And then you can have incidents where there's both uh, the paranormal and alien related as well. A friend of mine, okay, I tell about an incident to illustrate this. I'll call him Ken. Ken is now deceased. But back in the mid 90s, in the Des Moines, Iowa area, there was a small group of us who, I'll use the term, played around with remote viewing.
Hmm.
And so on a Sunday afternoon, we would meet, and then we would have some. Each of us maybe would contribute a blind target and put it in a sealed envelope, and then somebody else would try to remote view and name what the target was. Blind target meaning that nobody knew what target they were targeted on. In other words, what subject they were targeted on. And Ken was really very good at this, and so I knew then his capabilities and so on. Um, Ken had been back to a conference on the East Coast, and he was in the Boston airport preparing to board the plane coming back to Des Moines. And knowing Ken, I wasn't a bit surprised when he called me the next day and told me what had occurred. I was not surprised to hear that he had placed himself on the plane among the very first to board, and that he marched himself back to the very back row of the plane and sat down so he could scan those that were coming on board. Ken had this capability, and I knew him very well and had known him for some time. And as he was watching everybody come along the aisles and so on, his attention became fixed on a tall, well-dressed, business-type individual who was putting his briefcase in the overhead. And in that same instant that Ken's attention became fixed on him, he suddenly realized that he was looking at a full reptilian alien. Now, in that same instant, immediately, the individual putting his briefcase in the overhead looked clear to the back row of the plane, and Ken forgot about it until the next day when he was in the supermarket with his wife. And then, of course, he called me and told me what had occurred. Now, obviously that individual did not want his identity space intruded upon. And so he temporarily induced the forgetfulness. Now, this is consciousness technology at work.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you've got the paranormal, frankly, on the side of Ken himself, and then on the side of the alien. So, you've got the dual thing going here. It's an interesting thing. And Ken was, I think, got a little more education that day.
Why is it that aliens only interact with certain people instead of interacting with everyone? What are they afraid of?
I don't know that fear or their being afraid necessarily, enters into it. Actually, I can go back to being farmer's wife and that sort of thing, and the fact that we were interested certainly for our dairy herd in certain bloodlines, and I can surmise, I can speculate that maybe there's an element of that. And on the other hand, who knows? It's their decision, obviously, to make. And it does appear that they are interested in our reproductive systems and so on.
All right, if they are so highly advanced and if they are so intelligent, why would they need the abduction scenarios to keep on going? Why do they need to abduct so many people when abducting one male and one female would give them all the answers they need?
Well, we might ask, why do they care about us?
I ask, why do people really care about them?
Yeah. Well, if we think in terms of energy, we all live in a sea of energy, and it appears to me that energy does not stay at home. Right now, for instance, you're emanating energy and I'm emanating energy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. To reinforce, it doesn't stay at home. Energy emanates. It moves.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and their warnings have been very, actually rather plain. To some abductees, they said, you're misusing energy on this planet. And of course, all we need to do is remember about Fukushima, for instance, which has been emitting radiation ever since March of 2011, every second of every day, from 3 reactors that,
Sure. But here's my question, okay?
Yeah.
No disrespect. But why do they make contact with people who really do not have the ability to do anything about what they claim they want? Why don't they go and make their presence known to the powers to be? Instead of you, Beverly, or to any of the other abductees that we've had on the show. This boggles my mind, that we get the stories that the aliens give this message to people who can't do a damn thing about it.
They have indicated that they have gone to the powers that be, but they haven't always been listened to. For instance, President Eisenhower, there's the reports by those who were piloting Eisenhower and so on, that Eisenhower met twice with aliens, once at Edwards, and I think the other one was at Holloman, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
Back in the 50s. And so, you've got this, well, look back to the Los Angeles raid of 1942 in February. There were squadrons of UFOs over Los Angeles.
Well, I think the word squadrons is a little exaggerated.
Well, all night long, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of witnesses to
Mm-hmm.
flyovers. I don't mean maybe 20, maybe 30. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of shooting back because
Okay, all right. So let me ask you this. I've heard these stories before. With today's technology that we have,
Mhm.
how come no experiencers or abductees come back with any evidence to prove their stories are legitimate?
well, why should they? On the other hand,
Why should they? Well, you're spinning a yarn. You're getting people to expect. You're expecting people to believe what you're saying,
Mhm.
but you have no evidence, nothing to support what you're saying.
That's right. You don't know whether, just as you raised the point a while ago, as to whether or not we could believe witnesses to come to us as investigators. You as an investigator don't know whether or not I'm telling the truth, but
Mhm.
you're listening to what my perception is.
Now, a real investigator, a trained investigator, looks for evidence that will bring him to the facts of the case. Hearsay evidence doesn't wash.
That's all you're listening to. That's right.
Okay, so we're just listening to hearsay evidence from people who have purportedly had these experiences.
And sometimes you have multiple witnesses who are reporting the same thing.
But
And
there's many times where these witnesses really do not have any idea what they're looking at. And the
Well,
paradola system kicks in.
yeah. Well, of course, if they don't know what they're looking at, they're very puzzled
Mm-hmm.
and they think it's strange
Sure.
because they want to know what they're looking at. Of course, that's what
Yeah.
we're all looking for. Yeah, right.
So when UFO investigators, and I don't know why they use that name, they're really not investigators. They're researchers, I'll go along with that. They research the stories.
Hmm.
So when I hear these stories that are hearsay, where the credibility of the person who is telling these stories is put under a microscope or put through the truth test,
Hmm.
and the majority of them fail miserably.
Yeah, you could, of course, you can make that point.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, there are witnesses that I've known for many years, so I
Mhm.
know their integrity from like a personal level. And so I would understand that I think they're telling the truth. For instance, a close friend of mine that I've known since the early 1990s, on I believe it was March 31st of 2021, she's calling me at 10 o'clock in the morning because of what had just happened at her home.
Mhm.
She had been, she's a extremely clean housekeeper, but she had 17 cats and 4 dogs.
Mhm.
And so there was great care in the feeding and the cleaning and all this sort of thing. And it's amazing what her house looks like. You wouldn't know it unless you saw all of them, which of course.
All right, my producer is telling me I have to take my final break, so please stand by. Beverly Trout is our guest, and we'll come back and find out about this event of March 31st, 2021 when we return. Don't go away.
Great.
Coming up in the next hour, Exonation, Oberon Zell is going to be joining us, so we're going to be talking about wizardry and folklore and cryptozoology. That's the next hour here in the X Zone. Our guest this hour is Beverly Trout. And Beverly, before we went to the break, we were talking about a lady that you know who had an experience on March 31st, 2021. She's a super clean person, except she has a bunch of dogs and cats. She called you up to share an experience with you. Go ahead.
Right. And apparently this had happened. She usually gets up about 6:15,
Mm-hmm.
and she's a very organized person. So what had occurred, 3 rather tall humanoids had come into her home as she was feeding her cats one by one, and were asking her advice on how to care for the cats specifically. At least that was her perception on as far as I think the dogs were left out of it. And so she's explaining and talking as she's going around, and now you have to understand at this point. Okay, think of a governor on a school bus, which allows the school bus to go a certain
speed,
certain miles per hour. Okay. Okay, the same thing can be applied and has been applied both on myself and apparently on her in order to keep the calm. In other words, to allow the spectrum of one's mental and emotional spectrum to just, be able to operate along a certain path and not to get out of hand and anybody, start getting shook up to the point of violence or anything like that. At any rate, so she's explaining about the care. Obviously, they wanted to know. And this went on because it's a long process when she feeds her cats. She doesn't, you don't feed them all at once. You give certain foods to certain cats, et cetera, et cetera. And she's explaining all this. And then she's calling me and saying it was like a haze in the house, but she was being followed all the time and the inquiries were being made and she was providing the information. They obviously, or at least I would speculate strongly, they had some animals in their possession and they wanted to be sure that they could care adequately for them. That's not, by the way, I had heard of a case that another researcher, an American Indian PhD, R.D. Six Killer Clark, had heard an account similar to this from a witness on a reservation, someone who had the care of horses and was really, cared a lot about horses as well as cared well for them, and was approached by an ET and said that they had problems. They had horses in their environment, wanted to know how to best feed them and care for them. And so that particular witness who interacted with R.D. Six Killer Clark gave the information and so on. But that's the only other case I've ever heard of, that is along this line of giving advice on the care of animals and so on.
Prior to 1967 and you having your first experience, were you interested in UFOs and the paranormal?
Well, in 66, people that I was acquainted with started talking about UFOs, and I said, sure, they exist. It was as if I had no question in my mind, but I emphasize that, my memories had been squelched, stifled.
So were you a sci-fi fan?
No, as a matter of fact, I do not. Sci-fi turns me off totally.
Why?
For instance, I've never watched Star Trek. Don't want to, and never will.
Wow, that's blasphemous.
Yeah, sure. But I've got enough high strangeness in my own life that I, for some reason, no, I don't. That's fine that other people are interested. But I want nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing.
Well, most UFO investigators that I've talked to over the many years doing this show, they tell me that the aliens, are just like they are in Star Trek. They don't want to interfere with what's going on here. They have the non-interference clause. There's the Federation. So I just thought maybe that you were part of that organization where they believe in Star Trek and everything that Gene Roddenberry thought about.
No, and the only reason I even knew the name of Gene Roddenberry is because I was in the UFO arena, so to speak, and I heard others talk about him. Other than that, I would never have known that there was any, I would not have known who initiated Star Trek.
Beverly, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And X Zone Nation, our guest this hour has been Beverly Trout. Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, I give this one a 2. And the only reason I'm giving it a 2 is because she seems like a nice lady. Do I believe what she's saying? Not in the least. I'll be back on the other side of this short break and come back at the top of the hour when, let me see, who's my guest again? Oberon Zell is with us. talking about wizardry. The next hour here in the X Zone with yours truly, Rob McConnell, from our broadcast center and studios in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away.